Waheguru Ji Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Bhai Sahab, thank you very much for coming on the Flawed, Foolish and Fantastic podcast. Flawed and Foolish is me and Kamalpreet Singh. We are here to learn from you. You are our fantastic guest for the day. And the purpose of this podcast, and there's so many podcasts out there, we've just been talking about it. The purpose of this podcast is to actually talk about you as an individual rather than, as well as your collective work, but to more find out the hardships, the work that you put in, the effort and time in order to bring out the Sikh history through publications, sites, websites, everything you've done. And it's to highlight you as an individual, because a lot of people will know Gurinder Singh Mann, the historian, the scholar who's put things out, but they don't know Gurinder Singh Mann, the individual, the human, his family life and things like that. So if you're happy, are you all right to crack on with the questions?
Absolutely, and I just want to say I'm really glad to be on the podcast today. You're undertaking a great piece of work to actually illuminate and help individuals across the world to actually learn more about Sikhi and the Sikh history that we need to kind of protect and preserve as well. So let's go with it.
That's the problem, isn't it? Like you said, we don't focus on the individuals, and then people end up going or disappearing, and you're like, where are they, sort of thing. So, no, thank you for coming. First question is always the most difficult one.
Yeah.
Because it's about yourself. Who is Gurinder Singh Mann?
I think as an individual, I always wanted to do something apart from the day job.
Yeah.
And what that means is we all have to do kam, we all have to get money, we raise families, and we have a presence in this world. Yeah. But that leaves you short. Yeah. It leaves you short because we run through life. We walk through life first, but we run through life because as we get older, the years are coming upon us. So for me, it was always been a case of what else can we do additionally? Yeah. And then it was always about doing something which I can leave. I wouldn't say legacy, because the word legacy means you've got to leave something in place for people, but more about impart education, some form of education which can actually, generations later will be able to say, look, this is a body of work which is important. It wasn't necessarily all the outputs I've done now, but it was my original goal was just to say, okay, let's work on Sikh history, let's get things out there which haven't traditionally been heard of before or known about before, because I think that was always the issue, because when I always picked up a book, it always had the same amount of information in, and we always started off with the 10 gurus, and generally all the books kind of followed that kind of trajectory, so to speak. So my idea was always to, as an individual, we work, we live, we raise families, but also at the same time, what can we do to actually elevate our minds as well? How do we elevate ourselves so therefore we are actually doing something for the community, for the GAM, but then also personal satisfaction as well? Because from this GAM, there has to be some kind of personal satisfaction in the sense that you feel over the number of years you've done your GAM, it's for the community, but self-satisfaction to say, look, I contributed towards X, Z, and Y. And I think that was always my goal, to say, but it makes you happy as well. Yeah. Doing research makes me happy. A lot of people think, oh yeah, GAM karde, it's a lot of hard work. It's always going to be hard work, but it's also self-satisfaction to say you've achieved something when you reach that goal.
It's the hobby, isn't it? The hobby keeps you alive.
The hobby keeps you alive, but hobby is like I would use that word slightly sparingly, if I can use that word, because this is not a hobby for me, as you can probably tell. This is really, but it overtakes your life.
I see a hobby as something that you are not being paid for. It's basically something that you're doing at your own will and cause. Yeah. Work you have to do, you have to work, don't you? But I see me doing the podcasts or the websites or the books. It's something I do because I enjoy it. It's the same for yourself. I've seen that all the way through.
No, absolutely.
And that's fine. So, first thing I want to focus on is your background. So my question to everybody is, tell me about your childhood and family background.
Yeah. So, obviously my mum and dad, based in the Punjab, different regions. They came into England in the 60s. My father was really educated. Actually, he'd already had a degree before he even came into England. Had already started at work in Chandigarh before he came into England. So I think that was really important. Coming from an educational background where father was really educated. My mum had come from a strong family of Jagirdars, which go back to the Daliwale missiles. So I had this kind of strong background about Sikhi. Growing up in England, in the early days, it was always about knowing little snippets of Sikhi, if I can use that word, and to some extent, it's not changed, believe it or not, I would say. We'll come on to that when you look at social media and things like that. But the idea, when you're going to a Gurdwara, for instance, you're actually getting information. Information is imparted on you. It's in a certain way. So we know what happens when you go to a Gurdwara Sahib, and we know what kind of information and what kind of sermons we would get, if we can use that word, is in terms of... you hear the Bani, you hear the Katha, but if you add another level to that, if you look at the historical side, the pictures that used to be on the walls were always the one about the Shaheeds.
Historically.
But without much context. So growing up, you're always thinking that Sikhs have always had, there's blood, there's massacres, things like that. And it's interesting because many, many, many years later, when you look into those stories, I personally think they could have been told in a different way or represented in a different way. Because I think shock and awe tactics of the Sikhs has always been there in terms of, understanding our Shaheeds and things like that. So when you see these kind of things, you have an inclination as to what they are, but you don't understand it fully when you're growing up. So when I was growing up, history originally was not really that important. It was only in my later years that I kind of thought, let's kind of understand and learn more about world history. So I did that off my own back anyway. So the Sochni was simply this: I will look at Sikhi at some point, don't know when, but let me look at world religions first. So then I started delving into the Egyptian side of life. I've even been to Egypt as well. So, it's those kind of things. I'm a kind of person, if I'm looking at history, I will go and try and visit those places. Look at ancient Greece, look at Rome, the Romans, look at South American religions, the ones which no one talks about, the Chinese religions, talk about Taoism, obviously Buddhism as well. So all of that I wanted to cover just to kind of get a background on life according to other people, if we can say that. So I think that was really important for me to kind of, whilst you're working, you're getting your education, because education, see, I started this before I went to university. So then I went to university in London, got a degree in management, so management system science. So I was actually inclined towards actually, working in management. But the history side had already started before I went to university. So ਜਦੋਂ university ਤੋਂ ਵਾਪਸ ਆਇਆ ਸੀਗਾ, I still felt that need, because when you're in a big place like London, you have a void as well. You get this void in terms of you're learning things, but there's a void. So when I came back, that is when I said to myself, okay, I need to do something with everything I'm learning. And it wasn't too long after I came back from university, started doing a bit of gum, that I said, you know what, I think I need to do this more in a challenged way. And that's when I got on to do a master's degree in South Asian religions. And that was just around about 1997.
Well, I'm going to hold you there. Because you've answered that like a politician. I've asked you about your childhood and family background. And all you talked about is mum and dad, not told me about schooling, life, family. Give me those first. The whole point of this is about you.
I mean...
What was your grounding and background? We can get to your education afterwards.
I mean, schooling was...
where were you born? Where were you brought up?
So I was born in Leicester anyway.
Okay,
So I was born in Leicester. I've lived in Leicester majority of my life, apart from when I went to university for a couple of years. That was only for about 3 years, but then I came back to Leicester. Schooling was always in the local areas, and generally...
Where did you go? Did you live towards this area then?
Yeah, I mean, I started off near Abbey Park.
Okay, yeah.
So grew up around that area. So no Abbey Park really.
Yeah,
really
yeah, no.
well.
So did you go to a primary school that's now
Yeah,
in front of the park
that's
itself?
right.
Yeah, on the corner, yeah.
yeah. So started off there, and then we moved more towards the Rushmead area.
Yeah.
And then it was the schools around here, Mella, and then Rushmead as well.
Yeah.
They were the key kind of growing aspects, and obviously at that time as well. Late 70s, early 80s, there was still that kind of national front,
There was big around here.
national front ethos going on as well. So you obviously face discrimination. I was a lot younger there, but my brother growing up and looking at his friends, there's always that element of, you know, racism going on. But interestingly, there's one incident where one day me and my brother were in the house.
Yeah.
And there was about a number of skinheads, probably National Front people as well. And there's one Abanda, and they actually literally dragged him and chucked him over our fence. And it was eye-opening because you used to see little bits at school, but because I wasn't attending that big school, it was an eye-opener as to what could happen to you at any particular time.
Yeah.
Some people say these kind of things actually kind of build you up to do,
Mould you, don't they?
yeah, make you emboldened. For me, it was more a case of, okay, well, these things are happening. How do you go around countering it? Now, I wasn't at that age where you could actually make a difference, but the only way people fought back at that time was physically. And, you know, that was the only way to do it, because there's no reasoning with people who
No, you can't.
hate the colour of your skin, for instance. So you would see a lot of battles take place between Apne Bande and the Gore, and then eventually in certain parts of the city you would see the change happening as well. But interestingly, I think what came about it was that you also had the mods scene as well, the mods.
Yeah.
And they were in between, whilst they looked like they were National Front, but they weren't, if that makes sense. And some of them were generally got on with the Asians, if that makes
They're
sense.
just trying to assimilate and be in the crowd, aren't they?
Correct. And so what has happened is, I think that during the early phases there was that change, and then everyone did start to get to get to integrate, but then work together as well, if that makes sense. So I think witnessing things like that was also important, because you tend to find that there's challenges.
Yeah.
There's this kind of idea about, is life always going to be like this? Because that's important, because in certain parts of the world, if you always see things like oppression, racism, things like that, you probably think, oh, it's always going to be the case.
Yeah.
But here there's obviously a change which took place, but obviously you don't see that around the world, where, let's just say, brutality, you know, oppression is a daily occurrence, if that makes sense. So seeing things like this was an eye-opener, but I was always confident, and I always have a belief in humanity, where that eventually the good will prevail over the bad, essentially, as well, because I think that's really, really important. This idea of negativeness is not something I believe in. I'm always a very, very positive person. And even jadon koi kam kharab hunda hai, if something is not going to plan, I always believe that eventually something good will come out of it. So, and that has to come over time, because when you're faced with challenges, when you have to overcome numerous things throughout your life, the concept of Jardi Gala reigns supreme.
Yeah.
And, you know, that goes back to our calm from the 18th century as well. So I'm glad that concept exists, because if you understand the concept of Jardi Gala properly, you will realise that even through the adversities of life, you carry on in life. Yeah. We'll talk about this. We'll talk about the Sikh missiles later on, but yeah, absolutely.
From that, just a quick thing, you mentioned you and your brother. Is that all your family settled?
Just
you, your brother?
Just me and my brother, mum and dad, and that's it. Really.
Do you have grandparents in the house? When you were
no, they were always in the Punjab, and they both passed away when I was really little.
Okay.
So I never had that input from them in terms of what I did, if that makes sense. Which it's a shame, I think, because I would really have loved to have actually got their input on life, the Punjab. And, you know, it would have been interesting if...
I was just like, you take the little pearls of wisdom that they give you.
Yeah, and then I'm sure I would have taken lots of pearls of wisdom. But my dad actually was able to kind of, or has done over the years, given me the information that they would have had, if that makes sense. So,
No, it's fine. So you've touched upon your education, and you've gone on to obviously you went from schooling here to management studies in London. Take me through your education, if you don't mind me asking, because your education and later on steps into, for me, the first piece of work into the Dasam. So if you don't mind me doing that.
So,
how do you go from schooling here in Leicester,
yeah,
management in London, then all of a sudden coming
back, I think what it was, like I said, as I mentioned, is there's this void. So I'd already started history before I left to go to university.
Yeah.
So that ladder was already started. I was already climbing that little bit of that ladder, if that makes sense.
When you say you were looking at history, was that as part of your studies, or was that a
No.
personal thing? So you were looking at world history yourself?
Just because I was interested.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I used to study maps,
Okay.
which were religious maps.
Okay.
That's different from a normal map. These are maps which tell you about religions and how they spread, for instance. So I was always looking at things from a different point of view. But going back to what you're asking, so I'm in London, I'm thinking, well, we need to do something different now, even when I come back. So normally people take a break, which I did for about a year and a half. And then what happens is the management thing's great, you're working, etc. But then I always felt that my brother had brought a book back from India. This is where the catalyst is. It was actually J.D. Cunningham's The History of the Sikhs, believe it or not. And I'm going through it and I'm reading it, and there's a few things in there which are kind of sparking my interest more than others. And that was Dasam Granth.
Yeah.
And in it he called it Dasvan Bhashaka Granth. Yeah. And it's like you ask that $1 million question, what is the Dasvan Bhashaka Granth? Yeah. And so it's sparking my interest. I'm looking at other aspects of Sikh history as well, which I'm just climbing on that particular ladder. And it's like, I'm not getting those answers. Yeah. We go to the Gurdwara, we ask a few people, and we're not getting the answers we want to. Doing a bit of research. Remember, this is just right at the tiny start of the internet.
So it's 90s, so we're talking mid-90s?
Yeah, we're talking about 96, 97. So between 95 and 97 is when I actually started getting this curiosity kind of thing about information and Sikh history, and not getting those answers. And in the end, I always felt that end of the day, if you cannot get the answers in life, you have to find them yourself. Yeah. And it has to come from within yourself. People ask me this all the time. Where did that spark come from? Where did you find the spark? It has to come from inside. Yeah. You have to develop that. Or a spark hits you, and then you get that bug. Yeah. That bug, once you get it, you never give it up.
Of course.
Because it becomes so important part of your life, essentially. Yeah. So what happens is I'm reading through, like I said, various texts, etc. And I think at the end of the day, I just thought, okay, well, I'm just going to do a master's degree course on South Asian religions. But as part of it, I will concentrate on the Dasam Granth. Yeah. Which is exactly what I did. And it was interesting again because information was very, very sparse at that time. We had some bodies of work which was there, and research-wise, it was very difficult to get the information. You could actually search for... In England specifically, you could research for information like in libraries and things like that. But what I did was I also contacted people in the Punjab as well. Okay. So I did get in contact with Punjabi University, Patiala, and various other locations to start off, if that makes sense. Yes. But my aspect on the topic was the role of the Dasam Granth in Khalsa. Okay. Which was a very, very nice icing on the cake of the subject, if we can call it that. Yeah. So it wasn't delving too much into the manuscript. You're not delving into the source material itself, but everything around it. Exactly. And the Nityanam Banis, for instance, which are the Nityanam Banis which contribute to the concept of the Khalsa. And it sounds very, very easy, and it to some extent it was, but like I said, from an information point of view, is very, very difficult. So looking at literature of the work of Pyara Singh Badam, for instance, even Dr. Ashta, Ratan Singh Junki, for instance, Dr. Dalit Singh. So there was a lot of source work that was available at that time, which I managed to get access to. Yeah. And that helped a lot. But then I was also formulating my own ideas as well, which about which Bania, from the Dasam Granth contributed to the Bania we have, for instance. So whether it's Jab Saab, Jopi Saab, etc. So I think it was great because I think it was that first stage on the Dasam Granth journey, if we can call it that. And so for me, doing that master's degree was really good because it makes you into a researcher as well.
Yeah.
You become the researcher, you know what archives to search for, you know how you want to formulate an argument as well.
Yeah.
Because that's what education is about, formulating an argument. But what I didn't like was, because remember at that time in the 90s, the Dasam Granth idea of authenticity had already been kicking around since about 91, 92.
Yeah.
It was done by the Institute of Sikh Studies. It all started blowing up quite a bit. So I try to stay away from that because it wasn't going to be helpful. It's never helpful. This idea of authenticity has never helped anyone, pro or anti, if I can say that. And so stayed away from that, stuck with factual information, and that was like the original start of that particular journey between 97 and 2001.
Right, so you started about 97 and 2001?
Yeah, so that was the
How
end.
did you end up getting funding for it? How did you approach somebody to go, I want to study this?
Well, the funding was, I paid for it myself.
Yeah. And that's one of the big things about it. It's not, you weren't funded in any way. Other people are funded by institutions or groups or whatever. And that's one of the things I want to touch on. It's not a case that your thesis or your hypothesis were already put forward by somebody else and said, can you research it? So how did you go, right, I'm going to fund this. I want to do this.
Well, I don't think the family were happy. They were like, okay, either bitch ki milna hai, that kind of stuff. You always get those questions. And for me, I was adamant, I was working and doing it at the same time.
Yeah.
So you're working a full-time job.
Yeah.
I was in management at that time, and I was doing this part-time.
Yeah.
And for me, even at that point, I was thinking eventually I will write a book on it. I will write a book on it. I'll write a book on it. So I was reinforcing myself in terms of what I do in the future at this early stage. But in terms of funding, it's always been the case. We've lacked Sikh resources to help people achieve their dreams, actually have some kind of body of work, for instance. We're really big on terms of seva. We're really big on terms of actually what the Gurdwara movement has done, but we lack still that kind of that bridge building where we can actually give resources to individuals to actually promote Sikh art, Sikh heritage, Sikh technology, that kind of stuff. We've become very, very big as a community, not just in the UK, around the world, but we still lack that kind of pot where someone can say, look, I want to research this, can you give me £50,000?
Yeah.
Even the think of £50,000, people start crumbling. 50,000 is a minimum. Yeah, 50,000 minimum. We should be looking at pots of £500,000 being given to individuals to start and work on certain things which will help promote our Sikhi. Those never existed then. They don't exist now. They do exist in terms of philanthropists who do fund certain things. But for me, it was always a case of, well, I'm going to have to do it myself. And I never looked back because I always thought, well, okay, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it.
Yeah. So what university did you go to? What did you
So,
talked about any?
Yeah, so basically, because I'd come back to Leicester, and what happened was I enrolled at De Montfort University because there was no Sikh courses. There was no Sikh courses where you could actually apply to do a BSc or whatever in Sikh studies. So what happened was there was a course which allowed you to actually bolt on things. So there was this South Asian religions course. So via that route, I could actually work on the Dasam Granth as part of my dissertation via that title. So again, the interesting thing was I learnt about Buddhism, some of the Chinese religions which I mentioned about, Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, and then I was able to incorporate the research techniques for that within the work I was doing on the Dasam Granth as well. So it was here in Leicester, all the research was generally done in Leicester via archives across the world and things like that as well.
So, the one for university, what did they say to you when you first went there? This is my idea.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for me, the supervisor, the actual person who was the supervisor of the department actually liked the idea.
Okay.
Because he said we haven't really been approached at all ever in terms of the work you're doing. So he goes, I just have to find an appropriate supervisor, but we have no issue with you actually doing this because we think it'd be a great idea, especially on Sikh studies and Sikh history, because we don't generally get many people who work in this area. So they were pretty actually kind of responsive to it, which again you'd find strange because otherwise it's maybe other people may have talked them down, but I think the individual who was the supervisor of the course, he'd already worked on India itself, if that makes sense. So he kind of had an inclination that something novel like this would be important and just be contribute to the field of education essentially.
Yeah. And out of that, because I'm not going to focus on this as much, but out of this studying, during that time when you were studying this course under university, is there anything prominent that comes to your mind that you remember that, did you have access to things through the university that you wouldn't have access to if you'd done the research on your own?
I think, like I mentioned, you have access to things like digital archives, okay, but they were at their infancy at that time.
Yeah, of course, there were microfiche, right there.
Yeah, there's lots of things with microfiche. So other things, the archives were there, but a lot of things hadn't been digitized or hadn't been put onto the systems, if you can call it that. So there was always that lack of information available. And as I mentioned, the internet was at its infancy. I remember going on to studying as a module, and it was like how to search the internet. This is right,
we were at Montfort Uni, 97, 98, where they had the 4 computers only that could link onto the internet. That's all they had before they put the rows in.
Absolutely. And so therefore, to have a module called How to Search the Internet was actually, just shows you how, researching had changed, was about to change. So I was just there right at the start in terms of how things would actually now change for life. So I'm glad I was actually riding that wave in terms of how I would be researching history in the future. But in saying that, I've always considered myself a field scholar. So as part of this journey, I'd also gone to India as well, just to contact a few people. I didn't know that many people at that time, so it was very limited as to who I spoke to at that time. But later on, I would realise that unless you're actually going out there in the field, when I mean the field, literally in the field sometimes, whether it was researching the Anglo-Sikh war battlefields, for instance, whether I'm actually researching Havelian in terms of Sikh missiles, for instance, or anything, it's really, really important that whilst we do have repositories of information, archives, we still, all scholars should go back to the idea of visiting places, visiting Havelian, Gurdwara, other locations, because that's which gives us the one-up in terms of, because our history is in the Punjab, you can find history in the books, you can find history in archives, but you have to be there. You speak to people. Speaking to people, listening to people's memories, people's understanding imparts your way of thinking.
So you've gone, like you said, you've gone into the fields itself, you've gone into India. Is there a prominent thing that you found on your research for the Dasam at the time?
In India, it was more superficial. When I mean superficial, it was like general information. A lot of it was very, very general in terms, because at that time, like I said, in the 90s, you started getting, you already had that kind of clash going on, if that makes sense. So you had an issue in terms of people not wanting to share information. People didn't realise if you were pro or anti, so they were splitting you up. So they were not as forthcoming as to share information, because it was like, well, what's going to happen with this information? Some of the people who had proudly had Swarups, for instance, were being guarded because they just thought, is someone going to come in? Are they going to take what I've got?
Or desecrate it, or whatever,
etc., etc. So, and that's an important point, because we talk about Bedbi and we talk about things which happen, but it was happening also at that particular time because of the fact that people were against the Dasam Sahib, so therefore they just wanted it removed from places.
It's basically what was happening with the Ragamala for 100 years.
Exactly.
Now
Yeah, exactly. So, and interestingly, I mean, obviously 1984 played a part. It's like when there was a mindset in people's thinking.
Yeah.
But in the 90s as well, there was like another wave of, bias against Maharaj Bani, which you could see, and it was getting vociferous. So through the 1990s to the 2000s, it was like almost a war was taking place.
Yeah.
And there were people saying that the Sikh Garm is going to have schisms in it, like very a number of dharms have had, and it was getting to the point. Luckily, apa bach gaye. I think if you look at it as a conclusion, we were a bit lucky because bit by bit, people started to calm down again. But look, going back to your question, I think the information on the main parts of the Dasam Granth came after my dissertation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there isn't anything that stands out to you that you thought when you got there, you were just like, that is definitely, I need that for a piece of work.
Well, it was more a case of like the actual research work that had already taken place, like Professor Badam, like I said,
that you could work off their
the
work.
Ashtar, and then putting their theories together, if that makes sense, because that gave a framework. So because they were separated out, so when we talk about Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, and we talk about then his history, and then we talk about the Bani, the information was scattered in various places. The idea was to actually have a starting point where we could start bringing these sources together, and then we could start. So that for me was that, like I said, the starting point of bringing sources together, where we could now start to actually plug away at actually having a history and compilation of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib.
No, that's awesome. Well, that goes on to the next question, which is, tell me how that led to your books with Kamalroop Singh, because you ended up bringing 2 Dasam Granth books out with Kamalroop Singh.
Yeah.
How did you go from your studies upon the Dasam Granth to all of a sudden creating the book with the Archimedes Press and then later on with the Oxford?
So, finish in 2001, the dissertation is done. The interesting thing is, we talk about technology and all the work I've done in technology since then as well. But interestingly, I'd actually created my own website. I'd done it myself. I'd put my dissertation online, which is a very novel thing to do. This is circa around 2001. And it caught the eye of a few people in India. People like Gajaranjit Lamba, for instance. And he actually was the editor of the Sant Sabaya at that time. And we got talking, and he said, can you contribute a few articles to the magazine, which I did, which is novel because majority of everything was in Punjabi, but he goes, if you want to do it in English, I said, fair enough then. So my contribution was the only contribution in English in a magazine which used to be spread all across Punjab, was endorsed by the Akal Takht Sahib and the SGPC as well, and it was now reaching a new audience, if that makes sense. So that was the next kind of trajectory of where my come was going. So those kind of articles were things like looking at John Malcolm, for instance, the English perspective on the Dasam Granth. So the Sketches of Sikhs, what does he say about the Dasam Granth? And then also Charles Wilkins, when he visited Patna Sahib, and how he viewed the Dasam Granth. And these were really important factors because they looked at Dasam Granth from a different perspective from, say, how Apne Bande were looking at it. So it was adding to the body of knowledge. It wasn't the end all or be all, but I wanted to just write about something different. Remember, this is different from, whilst there were snippets of that in my dissertation, this was now like 5-10 page essays now, literally going to the crux of manuscripts as well. So in the Patna Sahib essay, for instance, I talk about the 1698 Dasam Granth Sarup, for instance, and then now I'm going into more the manuscript side of the Dasam Granth Sahib. And there's other articles as well, like the Bachata Natak and so forth and so forth. So that had now kind of led me to work a lot more privately now, after the dissertation, work more on articles, for instance, look more into the Surups, for instance. And then I think it was about, I can't remember the year, it had to be midway, might have been 2005, might have been earlier, might have been later, I can't remember offhand. Met in with Kamalroop Singh as well. Now Kamalroop Singh was already researching the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib as well, independently.
He was.
So
he was doing it when I was at uni.
Yeah.
So that. So when we took 99, he was already doing it
Yeah.
then.
So the work he was doing independently himself. Then eventually he would then go on to enlist to do his PhD on the Dasamran.
Yeah.
But what we always said was that we, rather than both of us do our work independently, because one, it was a complicated subject.
Yeah.
B, there was no reason why we should reinvent the wheel, but combine our resources together to actually create a couple of publications.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing was he came from the subject differently.
Yeah.
I came from it differently, but then we merged our ideas together.
Yeah.
And as two bra, we would also disagree on things as well. Yeah, as all families do. But at the same time, I think the combination of his skills and my skills were complementary. And I can give you examples of that. So originally, the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh Kitav was supposed to come out first.
Okay, yeah, I remember.
That was supposed to come out first.
Yeah.
But with the process with Oxford University, it takes a number of years.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, we wrote the Siri Dasamra question and answers first because we thought let's do the primer first, because the primer would give people a great introduction. So 50 questions, 50 answers was really important to get people on that kind of level to actually kind of dispel myths, but also delve into history.
Yeah.
The Granth of Guru Gobind Singh was this academic piece of work where we combined these resources together.
Yeah.
And the reason it was successful in the sense that how we could pool these resources together was his gum was quite considerable on linguistics.
Yeah.
Okay? So understand the language. This is when people always say to me, well, when did you learn or when did you start working on Sikh relics and artifacts? For me, it was always, all right, we have the manuscripts.
Yeah.
We want to kind of elaborate on the Purane Sarups and what they entail. But one factor which people had always forgotten about is how is Gurbani or Bani disseminated. When I mean disseminated, we talk about we go to the Gurdwara or the Dharamsala at the time, and you hear the Bhat. But how is Bani really disseminated in the real world at that time? In the Guru period and even the time of Guru Gobind Singh. Geez. So that's when I started looking at things like the Jarena of Guru Gobind Singh, when we have the Bani inscribed on
relics, on
relics,
things that were worn,
on relics and artifacts. And this was very novel because no one was looking at that. It was in isolation again. So when I talked about bringing all the material together on Dasam Granth Sahib, it was not just language, the sarups, the ityas from the 18th century. I wanted to do something more in terms of the relics and the artifacts, so I brought that into the mix as well, because I always
was that included in the book?
Yes, it's included. In the Oxford book, there's a whole general.
So how do you and Kamalroop go? We want to do a book together. What's it going to incorporate?
Well, interestingly,
because I remember being sat here with you when you were doing it.
Yeah.
And I remember Kamalroop's translations being sat there and you were going through them.
Yeah.
And he was going through your bits.
Yeah.
So how did you come up to that?
So the idea was he concentrated much more on the translation side. I concentrate much more on the history side, but that's not saying he didn't contribute, because obviously he did contribute on it, but that's where he wanted to get the translations of certain Bania which were excised.
Saki Lakidangali, and then you had this
Sukhmana,
Sahansanama, so they were in that.
Yeah. So and I said that's great, because what we could do is we could just do the same old translations. It's good, but why don't we do something novel? So the whole book was novel in the sense that it's presenting something new. So the translations were important, but I wanted to bring in like the history in terms of the relics, for instance, as well. So the sarups in conjunction with the relics, and then that gives you a trajectory, because when you have something tangible, I'm not just talking about the Jarena. We also brought in things like Tamar Patre. Okay, Tamar Patre is the old copper plates, for instance, which have always existed in India, Pakistan, but people didn't know how to actually how to actually kind of interpret them. So my work was looking also on, well, if we have a Tamapatra, what's the purpose of that?
Yeah.
Why would Guru Sahib give that? Why would he give that to Hindu pundits as well? Let's bring another level of intellectual research into this as well. Why is he giving it to the Hindus, not to Apne Bande? So there's all these kind of concepts which came to play.
Yeah.
And then we start looking at the swords of Guru Sahib. Have they been inscribed with Dasambani? So we start building this level of information which previously people weren't looking at.
Yeah.
So I wanted to add that into the mix. So in terms of the work itself, Kamalroop would work on a chapter, I would work on a chapter, then we would swap it around.
Yeah.
Then we essentially were
I
editing
saw
our
that,
own
yeah,
work.
that's what you're doing.
We were editing our own work
It's,
essentially.
What do we call it? I can't even remember what we call it. But at work we have to do that. So in order for something to go to court, somebody else has to assess it.
Yeah.
Make sure it's all.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because we were very vigorous.
Yeah.
He'd be very critical of mine. I'd be critical of him, of his work. He'd be critical of my work, and that was really important in order to make a very polished kitab at the end of the day. And I think it was a painful process because he's critiquing my work, I'm critiquing his, but then you come up to a point where it becomes as perfect as it can get.
Yeah.
It's a very maybe a strange way of doing it, but it worked out well in the end. And I think that's the beauty of it when two people are working, and remember remotely as well.
Yeah.
So you're not working.
I remember you were emailing stuff to each other at the time. That's what it was.
Absolutely, and so you're emailing things, and then you're getting things back, and there's things lost in translation, literally. But it was, I think, when we got to the end of this process, it was something which we believed was a really. In fact, I'll tell you a little story about this as well. We were given the word count, for instance, was supposed to be X amount of words or something. Me and Kamalroop wrote so much, it went well off the radar. And when we presented the book to Oxford University, they were like, "You're about 100,000 or 50,000 words over the count." And we were scratching our heads, and we were thinking we did all this calm, and now we're going to have to take this out. So just between yourselves and the people who are watching this podcast, there's a lot of material me and Kamalroop did not put in that book, which is still out there and has never been released.
So how did you even approach Oxford?
So my Karsh was always...
Because there's going to be other people out there that
Yeah.
There's a lot of research now going, well, how do I get my book to that level?
Well, my Karsh was always this. If there is this kind of dilemma, if there's this kind of war going on between pro and anti-Dasam Granth, your Kam or our Kam has to be at its highest level.
Okay.
We could have self-published this work, which, you know, through our comedies we did the question and answers book, but this had to be at its highest level so it would remain in place for decades to come.
Okay.
So we just literally emailed Oxford University and said, how do we put a proposal through?
Yeah.
And it was simple as that. Our proposal was very, very watertight.
Yeah.
We'd explained that our Kam was going to be very unique. Okay. None of the information had been published. Well, a lot of the information had been published before. So we're very honest about it, but at the same time, we knew we had a great project on our hands. So eventually they actually said, yes, we would. This is a book that we want to publish. But the key point in this, like you mentioned, for newcomers is it can be a long process. It's not simply contacting them and then you get a response back after a week. You would get responses back after a month and a half, and so forth and so forth. Even when we had our first draft, it took months before it was sent to reviewers and then to get the comments back and then to work on it again. Because a peer review approach is lengthy.
Yeah, no.
And if you're not prepared to kind of hang in there, you know, this is not the work for you. So the main, I think it's got better. I think it's got better in terms of, you know, the work does come back to you quicker these days from these bigger institutions. But it was always that case of frustration as well. You're not getting it back, so you can work on it and then you can finish it off. So
what was the process? Tell me the process, rather than just going, we sent off an email. What do you do?
So you literally you would email Oxford University.
Yeah.
They would then say, okay, you would need to fill out a form.
Yeah.
The form is like actually stating why your book is novel. Most publishers do this anyway.
Yeah.
Why is your book important? And that's it. You put in your chapters that you want to work on. You put in footnotes. You put in some bibliography in as well.
Yeah.
You put in why you think this book will actually be an important body of work.
Yeah.
So unless you've got all these things before you're actually applying, then you're not going to get off the kind of, you're not going to get the foot on the ground essentially.
Yeah.
So whenever you have a great idea, it's the backup which comes along with it as well. It's not just what you're going to be writing, it's how you're supporting this book in terms of making sure it's going to be received well as well. So the form gets sent, then we don't hear anything for some time.
Yeah.
Then we get an email back saying they want to consider it further.
Yeah.
And then you get this
Backwards and
forwards until a contract is actually signed. But we had an actual other problem as well. We were actually in the middle of our book and the commissioning editor left.
Yeah.
So again, that was another 6-8 months before our book then restarted again.
Yeah.
And that was that was a certain delay in the process as well, because what the commissioning editor does, he has to ensure that, from start to finish, the book gets done. But when someone leaves, then it kind of had a bit of a dent in terms of our getting the book done quickly, really.
Yeah. What was the cost implications?
Well, cost implications is, again, it was absorbed by myself and Kamalroop Singh. We didn't get any funding for any of the work.
Okay.
I think Kamalroop got...
And I think that's what people want to know.
Yeah, there was no funding for this. No one said, here's £500, go to India, do a bit of research. Kamalroop might have got some funding for his PhD from what I remember, but very minimal, which may have contributed to our body of work. But again, own resources, own money going into this, spending... If you think about it, from 2001 to where we are in terms of 2001 and where the book came out, 2011, a lot of the work, a lot of the research, was just done and paid for by ourselves, essentially. And quite rightly, we could have done with funding to get this project done, because it took hours and hours and hours of work to get it to where we wanted to get to, if that makes sense. And you will never get that time back, but it's not that. It's not about the hours which are a issue. It's the actual fact that, like you said, now, so many years later, people can now see the kind of the work taken in order to actually achieve this, the research taken to achieve this, and what cost as well. When I mean cost, it's always the opportunity cost. Could I have been on a higher ladder through my work, for instance, where I was actually concentrating more on this? Could I have achieved other things outside of this? There's always going to be that cost to your family, where you're not actually available to do things, but spending more time on this, for instance. So there's always a cost, but...
What was the cost on just getting the book released? Not your personal cost, as in just getting an ISBN, getting a hardback cover, picking how much it's going to cost, how many copies you want. What was that sort of cost like? Or was that done? That
was done through the publisher. The publisher would actually kind of determine all those kind of things.
Okay.
We don't see that because they're... So just to kind of put down different concepts of publishing as well. So you got things like self-publishing, where you publish yourself. You know how the concept of, you know the concept of self-publishing. You'd go through a publisher, or you can do it online. And you actually put your money in, you decide how many copies you want. With the higher publishers, once you've got a contract, they do everything. So you don't have to contribute towards that. You do contribute towards images, for instance. So if you want to actually pay for images, you would have to do that yourself. You'd pay for that, and then you would have to confirm that you've got the copyright to include into the book. So there'd be costs for images, for instance, things like that.
So that's fine. So you didn't have to go... Because there's some publishers that go, we'll do your book, but it's going to cost you £6,000.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to cost you this much.
But this is the difference, you see. There's a difference between vanity publishing, self-publishing, and I would call proper publishing. Proper publishing is when you've had a contract from a publisher where your work has actually there's no cost to yourself from the
Yeah.
publishing aspect, but that hides the research costs. Hides
I mean, you say that, but you've just given 3 different types of publishers. Tell me where their research costs are. Because it hides theirs as well.
No, it hides
Yeah.
theirs. But what I'm saying is, in totality, if that makes sense. If you're looking at it from total costs, if
Yeah.
that makes sense, you've got those costs are kind of paid for because you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
And that was the reason why we wanted to go with Oxford in the first place,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. So you asked the question, why go for the biggest, one of the biggest publishers? Because then that would all be catered for, if that makes sense. But it was a longer process and a difficult process. But it did cover that aspect of it, if that makes sense.
So the payment's all done, all the books are covered, everything's on there. That's right. So you didn't even have to pay for an ISBN or anything like that, everything's covered through the publishers?
Everything's all covered, yeah.
No, that's awesome. No, that's not a problem. From there, obviously you've talked about how you've gone about putting this together. There's a big gap between book 1 and book 2. But between that, one of the things that I came to see you about was you working on Dr. Leyden's works. Now, a lot of people don't know who Dr. Leyden was or what his works are.
Yeah.
You've put out a small publication on that and you've got a website on that as well. Can you talk about how you found the works of Dr. Leyden? Who is Dr. Leyden and what are these works?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned at the start, I'd already been looking at British sources on Sikh history anyway. And those sources were things like John Malcolm, Sketches of Sikhs, and talked about Charles Wilkins as well, and his visit to Patna Sahib. But within John Malcolm's work, the Sketches of Sikhs, he gives citations of where he's found certain Sikh texts from. So he talks about things like Sikh and Bhagat Mala, he talks about the Bajit Natak, obviously, because he's talking about Guru Sahib. But then he's also stating that he got the translations from A1 Dr. Leyden, Dr. John Leyden. After doing a little bit of research, you find out that Dr. John Leyden was someone who was based in Scotland. He'd actually was a Christian minister, and then he'd gone out to India. And then when he'd gone out to India, he'd, became part of a translation school in Calcutta, or Kolkata, we call it now. And he was a person who just translated work. It could be anything, he would translate it. He was a linguist personified, essentially. So when he's in India, he's learning all the different languages, Hindi, Marathi, and Punjabi as well. And somehow, and this is where we don't know, he had got a manuscript of Sikh texts. So we look at Calcutta over here, the Punjab over there. And he managed to actually translate a number of texts. And these texts were the Sri Bajit Natak, included the Prem Sumara Granth. And these are very novel and interesting texts, as we all know. But for him to do those ones was really, really peculiar. There's texts like the Kurka, for instance, which is a discussion on Guru Sahib and the Sahibzadeh, for instance. And there's certain portions of Sikh and Bhagat Mala as well, and so forth and so forth. So I'd kind of come across the fact that these translations were already in the British Library. So certain texts I'd already...
How did you figure out they were there? Because it's only mentioned within his book. But
it was mentioned within his book, but I think in the work that Paramjeet Singh and Amandeep Madra did, they kind of mention it briefly, if that makes sense. They mention it briefly, but they didn't actually go into...
In Sikhs and Tigers.
They didn't go into it in depth. So I'd actually went to the British Library and procured the translations. I'd spoken to them about it as well. And I thought to myself, there's got to be more than what's already there. So that in itself was a great body of knowledge. But then I started digging deeper and started looking at individuals who may have brought these texts back to England. And I came across a name by the name of Mackenzie. And Mackenzie was the collection in which the works of Dr. Leyden were. So the Mackenzie collection. So searching under Mackenzie, I found out that there's something turned up called Brahim Samara Granth.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's when I hit the nail on the head. And I actually found the manuscripts related to that. Went to the British Library, found it, and I was gobsmacked. Because you had two different versions as well. You had the correct version, you had the incorrect version, and you had a little translation of the Jap Sahib as well.
Okay.
Just a very small portion of it as well.
What do you mean correct version, incorrect version?
So basically, it's ones with mistakes in it, which has been corrected, and then obviously the real version. And interesting, they were all put together.
Okay.
And the interesting thing
So
is...
it's basically like a draft on a file.
A draft, yeah, absolutely. But all still there together.
Yeah.
So the importance of John Leyden in its totality was the fact that he was... Previous to that, it was always suggested that we had people like Cunningham, was the first Sikh translator. Then after Cunningham, we had other people as well. And it was becoming a point where this was now going to challenge people as to the texts of the Sikhs had been looked at, had been studied by the British a lot earlier.
Yeah.
So this was where the challenge was now going to actually change the whole Sikh world in terms of looking at where we present Sikh history, especially from the British point of view or the colonial point of view, if we can call it that. So Leyden's translations were a absolutely kind of belter, if I can use that word. It's a British word, belter, in terms of where Sikh history could now be repositioned. It repositioned in terms of the time when the British were working on the text, but also shedding light on history of our Punjabi texts as well.
Okay.
So positioning in terms of we now can place Dr. Leyden as being the first. There would have been other people who would translate Sikh text, but very, very in small portions.
It's the first that you've got, we can put our hands on, isn't it? That's it.
We can put our hands on, but more importantly, and this is the important bit, was as Dr. Leyden was a translator, he wasn't like Ernest Trump.
Yeah.
So when Ernest Trump did his translations of the Guru Granth Sahib, and he tried to do it on the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, his work was actually labelled as being incorrect. He had a lot of deficiencies, for instance, even though he was considered a linguist. But Dr. Leyden was, like I mentioned, a linguist par excellence. And therefore, his translations, personally, this is a personal thing, you may disagree.
No, it's not that.
Yeah.
There's a very big difference between translating the Dasam Bani to Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Bani.
Yeah.
Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Bani is not about the word for word translation, because a lot of it, all of it is intrinsic.
Yeah.
Dasam Granth is not intrinsic.
No.
Dasam Granth, this is why you look at a Dika on the Dasam Granth to Dika just as Japji Sahib.
Absolutely.
The Japji Sahib is massive.
Absolutely.
The Jap Sahib is extended. That's about the only one. But then after that, there are no intrinsic meanings after that. There might be like an intrinsic sort of meaning for some of the chitras, but that's explained within the works itself. So you don't have to delve into it. It's very different. So what Ernest Trump was doing was obviously translating, but he was translating the Padat. He was translating word for word what the word means. But it doesn't actually give an insight to what Gurbani is stating.
But he actually says as well, he actually says he finds it difficult. And then what he does, he contacts the British and says, I want more money. And in the end, because he can't understand it, he gives up the project entirely.
Which is understandable, because that's the difference between Sri Guru Granth Sahib every other text. Even when you read the Quran's got the Zahid and the Batin, those are the two things. So Gurbani has exactly the same, but the Dasam doesn't. So the Dasam to certain points has intrinsic meanings, but it's not all the way through. Gurbani is, that's why they say it's a God board, it's beyond comprehension.
Absolutely.
And I can understand why it was easy for Leyden to translate the Dasam than it was for Trump to translate the Guru Granth Sahib.
But that's entirely true. But the truth also comes in the fact that this was like 50, 60 years before Trump. And that's important as well. It's the time period as well. It's like the early 1800s. Okay, he's circa, let's say 1805, 1808 is when he's doing this scam. And it's like a very early period as well. And then remember, this is the time when in the Punjab, Maharaja Ranjit Singh is now coming into he's ascended the throne, has become Maharaja Punjab, and his come, and there's very little contact with the British at that particular point as well, from the Punjab at that point. So for Leyden to have done this in isolation in Calcutta, maybe he had got a little bit support from. Now, there's a concept when maybe Nirmala may have helped, etc., with his translation, whatever. But the accuracy, when you use the word Sri Akal Purkh, for instance, you can actually see it in the concepts, in the translations as well. So its accuracy is important as well as translation. So for me, Dr. Leyden was not just the first, but accuracy-wise, it was a lot more than maybe the later commentators were able to do or comprehend, if that makes sense. So and I think the body of work that Leyden has left us is absolutely extraordinary. So therefore, we had to do a project on it. Later did a small booklet on it, and in the recent book, The British and the Sikhs, I've devoted a chapter on Dr. Leyden as well. But I think there's more that needs to be done in terms of actually bringing that work out, because it's so pivotal to Punjab history, colonialism, translations. So there's a whole lot of work which can still be carried on, which still needs to be done, essentially.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And I totally agree. There's a whole work on, just if you were to put Leyden's works as he's written and his translations, it'll be interesting because his concepts are pre-Victorian. The wording he uses is different. If I was to look at it in a Gurbani sense, is his translation accurate on the Bachitranatha? I'd say absolutely not. There's lots of flaws, but that was the only language he could use at the time, because those are the words that were in place.
Absolutely.
So it isn't about an inaccuracy in translation. It's about that is the vocabulary that was available to him. And I still think it's very important for that to come out.
Absolutely.
So, Well, I hope there's a project somewhere that you're going to do on that one. How did you go from, obviously, I can see where this is linking up. Obviously, you've done the Dawson, you've done the Leyden stuff, you're looking into research. How did you come about with the Sikh Museum initiative?
So, as I mentioned, we'd been doing a lot of work on Sikh relics and artefacts anyway. So, originally, as part of the work I'd started on the Dasam Granth, like I mentioned, I wanted to look at Sikh relics and artefacts. And over the decades, there was always me going out to museums, the old idea being, the kursi of Maharaja Ranjit Singh at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and so forth and so forth. So, as part of, going back about just after the Dasam Granth Kitab had been finished, we'd been going out and about, just as other individuals now, working with different people to try and look at Sikh relics and artefacts. So, around about 2014-15, various members of our team got together, and we wanted to actually have a organisation which could do exhibitions, lectures, but also now delve into new technologies as well. So this was a kind of break from what I'd been previously doing, because now I'd be entering the world of technology as well. And this is groundbreaking because working with individuals like Taran Jit Singh from Taran 3D, it was merging history and technology. And this is the important bit, because we were now able to now say, okay, technology advances are now coming through. How do we now balance this in a world which is changing? Look at the shift from the time when I started, when there was no internet, to where the internet is now fully fledged. We have social media as well. So how can we actually portray Sikh history through the traditional routes as well, like lectures and exhibitions, but also incorporate digital technologies? So the idea behind Sikh Museum Initiative was always about doing something, again, novel, which I've always wanted to do throughout my career in Sikh history, is always to do something really novel. And so so the first project was the Anglo-Sikh Wars exhibition here in Leicester. And whilst I'd already tapped in, well, as a team we'd tapped into various museums to get relics for the actual exhibition, we now work with Taran to actually work on 3D modelling of objects as well. So whether it's the Kohinoor diamond, for instance, maybe it was like a talwar which had been used by the Sikhs, a gun, i.e. the brown bess, which was used by both the Sikhs and the British.
Yeah.
So to start modelling a few objects for this exhibition. So that was one technological innovation.
Yeah.
The second was to use AR kind of cards, basically.
Yeah,
augmented reality, essentially. So what augmented reality does is if you can shine a kind of camera onto an object, it makes another object appear, essentially.
Yeah.
So that was novel, so you could play around with like objects as well. So this exhibition was not... Well, it was novel in the sense that no one had done an exhibition on the Anglo-Sikh Wars since the wars had started in a major way. But then to incorporate technology into it it kind of gave it a new kind of definition. So the Sikh Museum initiative was to kind of actually work predominantly with Sikh relics and artefacts on other themes as well, but just to give the UK a sense of where history needs to be kind of defined, especially when there's so much ityas which came from the Punjab to the UK. It's a case of making sense of it, and that's the really easy answer. How do we make the sense of Sikh ityas which has come from the Punjab to the UK, and how can we do and make projects out of it? I think that's the kind of easy answer as to what we're trying to do and still trying to do as well.
I was about to say that's still running at the moment.
It's still running. We've done recently.
So you've had that going for nearly 8 years.
Nearly.
What are your significant finds?
I think the finds has always been about the actual different amounts of ityas which is here in the UK.
Okay.
Whereas probably before the 90s, in the 90s or just coming up to the 2000s and then 2010, we always knew that there were Sikh relics and artifacts through various museums. But when we actually started delving and contacting various museums and other institutions, the amount of material which is now we can now actually see was a bit of an eye-opener, because we always knew that ityas had come from the Punjab. But let me just break this down a bit for everyone listening on the podcast as well. There's different ways the ityas came to the UK. One is, if we can use in inverted commas, the loot, if you can say that. From the Toshakana of Lahore Treasury, for instance, there was this idea that many items were brought back, were taken by the British, essentially. So that was one concept. Then we have smaller regimental museums who'd fought in various wars as well, and they'd been able to pick things off the battlefield. And they brought them back as well. There was also things, interestingly, which many people don't talk about, was gifting as well. So the Sikhs had gifted a lot of items to the British. This is during the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So this had already been started in the early 1800 period. So there was ityas which came that way as well. People sometimes get confused and say...
What prominent gifts have you found from that period?
So that period there was Sikh manuscripts, for instance. So these are in the British Library. A couple. It was a couple. And there was also the cannons as well. So Sikh cannons were given by the British. And just to give you a really, really fascinating story on that as well, the British had given cannons to the Sikhs, and the Sikhs had improved on them, made them better, and then when they were using the Anglo-Sikh Wars, they were done a lot better than the British had done when it comes to the actual deploying of weaponry. But then the British captured them back and then brought them or melted them down. So that gifting was also taking place. And then there was also the sale of items as well. Interestingly, in the late 1800s, after the Toshakana had brought back, there was also items which had been sold in Punjab as well, and they got proliferated in around Punjab and various other locations as well. So we don't really know what happened to those items either. So there's different facets of how items have actually arrived in the Punjab, as you can see just from what I've just said. There was further gifting as well in the late 1800s with the Maharajas of Punjab, where it's Maharaja of Kapurthala, Patiala, Jind, and all these other ones.
The treasures of the empire, don't you? Well, they gift them to Prince Albert's.
Yeah,
who was,
Edward.
when he goes there.
So we had an exhibition here in Leicester.
Splendors of the
Splendors
Raj,
so in there was many Punjab items or Sikh items which the Maharajas had actually gifted. So overall, there's different shades of items which have come through over the years.
Yeah.
So when you say what's the most significant, I think the whole concept of the amount is really important. It's like
I agree with that.
They're everywhere.
I agree with that, but there's got to be some standout item for you out of all those.
There's always standout items in the relics and artifacts.
Yeah.
I don't like to always pigeonhole and cite one example.
Yeah, but if you don't cite them, people are going to go, well, there ain't any.
Yeah.
And the whole point is about creating intrigue and interest in people. So if you sit there and hide things away...
Oh, it's not about hiding.
But if you can't even pick two or three out and go, well, this is something
I never pick out two or three. I always go with the general. The reason I go with the general is because if we concentrate... Let me give you as an example the Kohinoor diamond. Let me explain why general sometimes is more important rather than specific. Now, we've got the Kohinoor diamond, for instance, and we know about the history, and people love to talk about it all the time. I get asked more and more questions on the Kohinoor diamond than anything on Sikh history, because they just love talking about this narrative. And I have to push them away from that narrative and say, oh, by the way, did you know that there's also other itihas which had been taken by the British and just as important, for instance. But no, you're quite right. There's no harm in actually kind of...
just citing a couple of things.
Yeah,
so for people to go, actually, I want to go and see that, or I didn't know that existed.
But
for me... Right,
but let me answer that question, actually. But as part of the Anglo-Sikh Wars exhibition, I thought some really interesting thing was like the coatee. So it was a coatee of not a Sikh general, but maybe of a child who may have been the son of a Raja, for instance. The great embroidery that was actually employed on it, we actually had that on display. And that's from the area of Worcester, for instance. And that's the only one of its type in England. There does none exist like this in anywhere, if maybe not even in the Punjab, because the style of clothing, as we know, with the innovations of the French and the Europeans who came into the court, actually brought about different kind of ways in which our clothing was changed as well. So that's a very significant find, which I thought was really important. One important Shastra, because it's the stories, I think, which are important. It's not necessarily about if they've got gold.
Monetary value of things like that. It's not that. It's about what. It's not about the monetary value. I'm going to quickly interject here. But two items from your, from the Anglo Museum first thing that you did at Newark Houses. So one was the Pothysad that you found at Leicester University. Because I'm like, well, how the hell have Leicester University got this? Right? So that for me was significant. The second thing for me that was significant was you had a Shastra that had been picked up from the battlefield.
I'm going to talk about that.
Right?
That's what I want to talk about.
That's another one. The third one is not from that period at all. It is from something you've done very recently, where we had an item of the month at the museum, which was the medal from the Chillinwala battle. Right? So that's... But then there's other items for me which are significant. Like, for me, the most significant thing out of all these things are the relics of Baba Maharaj Singh. Nunga, by the way. So that's probably the most significant thing, because you've got Gutka there, which has got the Panjbani in. Then all of a sudden you turn it and you got Chanaka's works in there. Which obviously was by Kavi Sanapath, but it's within their daily Nityanam that they read every day. So for me, that's what I mean. So if you're not going to elaborate on any items, people are going to go, well, I'm not learning anything.
See, what it is that when you've done so much work over a period of time, it unfortunately gets put into that kind of same pile. It's only someone like you who's coming today and asking about specific items that the memory gets jogged as to what's specific. But let me touch upon the sword, for instance. So you talked about this sword which is found in the battlefield, and I'll just elaborate on that because I found this story really fascinating. That was at the Battle of Aliwal, First Anglo-Sikh War, and a Sikh, whose name we don't know, was fighting one individual. He was a coronet, and they'd been fighting, and at the end of the day, they both got killed. and the sword was lying over the Britisher. And eventually, what the actual regiment did was they took the sword, they wrote the ityas as to what happened,
Yeah.
and then actually on the sword itself,
Yeah.
they inscribed what had actually taken place
Yeah.
to leave a permanent record between the Sikh and the British in this particular battle. Very significant because, again, you don't often see that, you see. And that's kept in Nottingham. So that was very,
where is
very
that? Because that's not in the. That's in a private collection, isn't it?
No, it's an actual. It's a U Munnery Nottingham Museum actually.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's an actual regimental museum
Okay.
where it came from essentially. So
I thought that was from a private collection. That's for me. That's quite significant.
yeah,
It's like, hang on, this
No.
is from the battle itself.
yeah. And it's
written in there.
and I've included that in the British and the Sikhs book as well because
Yeah.
I thought it was very, very significant. There's a photograph of that in the British and Sikhs book. But just to go back to the Sikh manuscript as well.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing was when we were looking for ideas on Sikh manuscripts, I'd already known about the manuscript at Leicester University for many years prior the exhibition. But with me, it's always a case of you may know where such an important item might be, but unless I'm going to do some work on it, do I really need to go and see it?
Yeah.
Or do I need to elaborate on it? Or do I need to do X, Z and Y? With this project that was coming across, we got in contact with the University of Leicester, spoke to the special archives there, and we were able to do interpretation and just to kind of just to correct you a little bit in terms of what's in the poti, if that makes sense. So there's Bania from Guru Granth Sahib and the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, and there's some apocryphal compositions as well.
Okay.
So it is a larger poti.
That's why I called it Bhoti, because
Yeah,
I knew it wasn't
exactly.
even
Yeah,
I knew
yeah,
it wasn't,
yeah.
I knew it was a compilation in the same way
Yeah,
Bob Marley
but interestingly, we talk about how the item had got into the UK. This was actually bought by an antiques dealer.
Okay.
And this antiques dealer had been buying many books and he'd gone around the world. So again, it's not a stolen item as far as we know. He's just gone to a marketplace somewhere and he's brought it back to Leicester. He probably didn't know the super significance of it. It was displayed in the 1960s. Here, that's the first time it was actually properly displayed in 1960. It was going to be used in a police case as well. So ਜਦੋਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਪੁਰਾਣੇ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਣੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ, you know, when they used to say, do you want to take an oath on the Bible or scripture of your choice, they were going to use it, but then someone intervened and said this is not the Guru Granth Sahib, so therefore you cannot use this in this police case. There was some work done by SOAS as well, and I looked at that work, but for us it was more a case of looking at the significance of it in terms of it being an important part of, you know, the battles during the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So whilst we got the British history, we also looked at the Sikh history as well, and quite rightly we worked with the university on several aspects. One was to actually have a correct Mirada as well. So we had the Shastras, which were placed nicely against the Guru Sahib. We also had Ramallah brought in as well, so to make sure that we're giving, you know, the correct, Satgar, etc. And in a way, we try to do it. We did something different, which no other museum has ever done in the past in the UK to date. In the future, you know, people always have issues about whether we should have suroops in public institutions and public locations, but we did the best we could working with the university, but also
I thought it was really well done.
Thank you. But also we wanted to make sure we didn't damage the Saroop as well. So we actually had a cradle created from the Bodleian Library at Oxford University to ensure that when the poti is placed, it's placed in a way which it doesn't damage the Saroop as well. So we learnt a lot of things in terms of manuscript conservation at the same time from the University of Leicester, and they learnt a lot of things in terms of how we view the Sikh scriptures and the history behind it as well. So it's been a great project, and we always work closely with that department now and in the future as well.
No, it's awesome, Steve. Right, how did you change your focus to research on different areas? Was it in relation to Sikhi or Sikh history?
Yeah, I think the work from the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib was a bit unique and very different, because that was a lot on manuscriptology. It was about the ityas from the 18th century and so forth. just coming up prior to the formation of the Sikh Museum initiative as well, I'd always had that interest in the Sikh Empire.
Yeah.
So the Sikh Empire was another area which I thought deserved attention. Together with that was the Anglo-Sikh Wars as well.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because you can't really separate the two, because the Anglo-Sikh Wars comes on the back of the Sikh Empire.
Yeah.
So I wanted to concentrate originally on the Anglo-Sikh Wars because it had never been covered in detail before.
Yeah.
So therefore looking at the battlefields, looking at the Ityas, looking at the Sikh relics which we just mentioned,
Yeah.
but then also making it palatable as well, because obviously there's a lot of people who don't want to talk about these things. A, because we lost our Punjab at that time, so
Yeah.
you know it's a source of pain, for instance, just like partition has been as well. But the annexation of the Punjab had to have a starting point. But let me tell you the real reason why we looked at the Anglo-Sikh Wars as part of the exhibition. At that time, there was a lot of work being done on the Great War.
Yeah.
Indians in the Great War, Sikhs in the Great War. But the problem when we have, okay, there's Bharti of Sikhs in the Indian army, for instance, they never gave any kind of background as to how they got there.
Yeah.
They never even talked about the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So it was a kind of bit saying, okay, well, that's great, and it's great that the UK is looking at Sikhs' contribution to the soldiers and Sikh Wars, and I'll come on to that later on as well for a future project we're working on. But there's no background. So whilst everyone was concentrating on that, we said, let's just take people back 50, 60, 70 years and go to the Anglo-Sikh Wars, where people can actually learn and say, well, okay, Sikhs fought against the British, but then later on there was this recruitment policy later on. So therefore the Anglo-Sikh Wars was really pivotal, not just for Apne Qaum, but for the British as well, to actually understand about where we were coming from in terms of this annexation. And because the thing is, over the last decade or so, we're getting these conversations now about decolonization, for instance.
Yeah.
We're getting these conversations about should artifacts be repatriated to various countries.
Yeah.
But so we were actually kind of looking at it differently by saying, okay, well, we've got these items here on display, but also we're using technology now to bring things to life as well, which I mentioned about. So we wanted to do something different, something novel as well. So, creating the Kohinoor diamond in 3D was absolutely, a game changer, essentially. And remember, not the Kohinoor diamond as
No, it was uncut, the uncut version.
The uncut version, and as it was on the arm of Maharaja Ranjit Singh at the time. At the same time, we also had a replica of the Kohinoor as well, which we got from, I think it was the museum in Shropshire, for instance. So to focus on different things like the Anglo-Sikh Wars and the Sikh Empire was always in my radar, but again, we needed a project in which to focus on. So essentially, the Anglo-Sikh Wars was done as part of the Sikh Museum Initiative's exhibition. Then I also wanted to focus a lot more about the British and the Sikhs as well, which leads us on to the book, which I created in 2020.
Yeah.
So the idea behind that was to look at all the various sources.
See, I remember, I'm just breaking up that.
Yeah.
I remember you doing an exhibition on Wellington Street, which had the two massive pictures of the Anglo-Sikh Wars.
Yeah.
Those the two big pictures.
Yes.
I remember on the same day that we were doing that, Hellion was selling their books there.
Yes.
And I can remember you saying at the time, well, hang on. I can remember you talking to somebody at Hellion at the time, so I know that was the starting point of talking to Hellion, but you hadn't even come up with the idea of writing the book.
No.
It was from that talk with Hellion.
Yeah.
And then prior to you even writing that, we had the LBC talk by Christopher Bryce when he was releasing his book.
Yeah. It's interesting because Hellion as a company hadn't got many Sikh books on their kind of portfolio, essentially. Meeting someone like Chris Bryce was important because we got to become really good friends over the years. He had been working on Hugh Goff.
Which is
Hugh Goff,
solid book.
a general in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and so he had already knew a little bit about the Sikh Wars and Sikh history, but he wanted a bigger contribution. So that's where this kind of liaison started with to have a book on the British and the Sikhs. Now, as you know from the contents of the British and Sikhs, some of the stuff I'd already previously written before, but repackaged. But with this time round, I wanted to actually kind of talk a lot more about the Sikh relics and artifacts, but also talk about the Sikh missals as well. So this is the first time where I'm now bringing the missals into additional work as well. And we'll talk about the missals later on, but it was just to have a trajectory of when the British came to India and what was the kind of association relationships that took place, whether it's during the Missal period, whether it's Ranjit Singh period, Anglo-Sikh wars, the Rajas of Punjab, going up to the employment of Sikhs in the Indian army. So, but interestingly, on the cover, for instance, we don't have the British as such, but I've put Baba Bagheil Singh on the front. And the reason for doing that was to actually say, well, okay, you talk about significant items. In this interview, you're asking about significant information, and what's this relic? What's this piece of history which actually is something different? The idea was to actually say that in 1783, when the Khalsa took over the Delhi, for instance, when we had Bagheil Singh entering Delhi, we have this impact on the British, which actually changes their focus and their vision of what the Sikhs are. It was a pivotal moment. So rather than actually say the British and the Sikhs, okay, let's describe or let's depict the Sikhs fighting in the British Indian Army, for instance, or the Anglo-Sikh wars, I wanted to take it back to the 18th century and have Baba Bagheil Singh there, because then what came about from the raids around Delhi and March 1783 was this idea that the British will now view the Sikhs differently, and then we'll start dialogue with them. And this is well before the Sikh Empire.
No, but this is mentioned straight within the Panth Prakash. That is what the Panth Prakash starts off with, where you get Captain Murray and all those others going, who are the Sikhs? Why is it they just come into Delhi every now and then and piss off every now and then, take whatever they want? They don't even look after the rule, they just go.
Marauders, plunderers,
they don't even plunder, they come in. They come in, they stay for a bit, and then they just go. It wasn't even that it wasn't like Ahmad Shah Abdali where they come and take slaves, they take money, they don't do it. They come and go, actually, we are, Delhi's one day rule for us, that's fine. But we can show that we can take this at any point. So even, Ratha Singh Pangu say basically this text comes about because the British are saying, well, who are the Sikhs? Because they're asking the local that are under the Pathans and the Mughals, and they're giving a false ideal of the Sikhs, and he's trying to get that information, send it back to the British.
That's it.
Here in London.
You're quite right, but this is going, so when Pangu's writing Panth Prakash, that's a certain period.
He's writing it historically of what happened. But by that time, obviously, he's in Ludhiana, and he's saying that I'm saying this here. So obviously, he mentions old Bagheil Singh, all that. That's we're talking 70 years prior to that.
But what's interesting is Ratan Singh Pangu comes from the Gloria Singha missal as well, so that's why he does emphasise quite a lot on Bagheil Singh, for instance. But we'll talk about the missal period a bit later. But
in his text, his focus is on literally one or two missals only, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
His thing about Rai Singh, Mehtab Singh, Sukha Singh, Bagheil Singh. He talks about one missal. He puts a focus on the missiles, but he doesn't really talk about them.
No, he says these are the stories I've heard.
He gives a defined aspect. That's what he says.
As my father, grandfather, everyone has actually told them.
That's what he says. I've heard these from Rai Singh, and I've heard these from Sukha Singh, so that's where these come from. And that's what he says. So he gives. It's like the approach of he gives a partial view of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, for me, the British and the Sikhs, the concept was taking it earlier, going back to like descriptions of Banda Singh Bahadur, going to the descriptions of Bagheil Singh, going to the descriptions of Sikhs in Delhi, that kind of thing. So, I wanted to actually just scrap what we'd come up with before and start off earlier, and then now delve into this missal period essentially.
Where was your research for that? How did you come about that? Because that isn't, as much as you had the museum initiative, you had relics, you had other things. trying to put that into a rounded book is a different thing altogether.
This is harder because in the sense that each chapter is like a book in itself, if that makes sense. So some of the actual examples, like I said, I'd already known about, but it's more about describing it. So let's just take examples of Charles Wilkins, for instance, which I'd already covered back in, the Dasam period that I'd working on. In fact, I'd actually taken out John Malcolm because he was such known about. I'd taken him out completely, but I'd actually added him in later on in the Sikh Soldier book actually instead. So there were some descriptions which we'd already had, but still had to start from scratch in terms of actually redefining them, reinterpreting them, and adding and padding them out for the Kadav. Like I said, the Missile period bit was unique because there was like some sources which had never been published before. As an example, for instance, as part of the Gurinder Singh Missile, there was an individual called Bunga Singh from a place called Danisar. And he'd abducted a British soldier. Yeah. And interestingly, my research actually led me to Scotland again. Okay. Same place as Dr. Leyden. And he'd captured an individual by Captain Stewart. Okay. So when I actually did some more research and found out that there was documents lying in Scotland which actually tell you about Captain Stewart and Bunga Singh, I was mesmerised. So I contacted the archives in Perth and they sent me some material and one or two letters. So we already knew that the letters existed, but to actually find them was a great find in itself. And this got incorporated into the book as well. So the Ranjit Singh period I'd concentrated on in terms of his life. The Anglo-Sikh Wars bit had already been researched as part of the exhibition, so I was able to bring that into the book. The new chapter for me was more about the British Sikh recruitment, if that makes sense. How do Sikhs get recruited into the Indian army? That was a bit novel for me. That wasn't really my area, if that makes sense. So that I had to research quite a bit on that to actually kind of make it a kind of a fuller book, essentially. So from different sources, using existing material, new material, to actually give a kind of great primer of the relationship between the two groups.
No, that's fine. Then how did you get about getting it published through Hellion?
So like
Hellion, if people don't know, is they do books on wars. Any arms and armoury military. That is what their forte is. Yeah. So how did you end up? I know you speak to Hellion, but how does...
So like you mentioned, I'd got this relationship with Chris Bryce at Hellion, and we just got talking, and he said, would you like to create a book or would you like to do it? But he didn't give me any title. I said, I said, what would be great is for readers is to have this primer between the British and the Sikhs going through various decades of history. So once again, put a proposal through. It was accepted, and the same process, the same as the Oxford one, it happened again. It was long overdue because 2015 is when the Sri Dasam the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh came out, and this came out in 2020. So there was a bit of a gap between the publication of the Gadavs, for instance, but it worked out really well because this brought in a new audience for people who had never heard about me, never heard about my work, for instance. So it was great from that perspective. And it was good as well because people wanted to read something different from Gurinder Singh Mann as well. They'd seen the work on the Dasam Granth and they'd known about the work I'd done on the Anglo-Sikh Wars in terms of the exhibition as part of the Sikh Museum initiative. But now here was something a bit more concrete in written form as well.
No, it's awesome. And that leads on to your latest book that you've released. So you've gone from the British and Sikhs, then what comes into your mindset in order to create the next book?
Well, interestingly, some of the research which was for that book got put into the second book as well. Okay. And sometimes this is the thing about some writers. I mean, especially when I'm doing research, information would get included in the first book. Then I thought, you know what? There will be things which I can maybe write about later on. At that point, there was no discussion with Hellion of doing a second book. Okay. So, there's always a risk if you don't include something in a book as well. So, but luckily for me, once the British and Sikhs had got great reviews, it was a no-brainer for them. They were like, yeah, we want you to do a second book. And I said, shall I do a part 2? They said, no, do slightly different. So therefore, what I did was, I did the rise of the Sikh soldier. The concept being here, how did the Sikhs become a martial tradition? So I start off talking about the Guru tradition in terms of, Sant Sabai, Miri Biri, as an introduction. And I also talk about the missile period as well. But what I really want to kind of allay to Apne Bande and British people here in England as well is that when we get to the 1800s and there's this idea of the what do you call it, the martial theory, the martial concept, and having Sikhs as a martial tradition. I wanted to challenge that concept as well, because the Sikhs were always martial. From the time of Guru Nanak, he was challenging oppression, tyranny. When he writes in the Guru Granth Sahib against Babur and Babur Vani, for instance, he's talking about this oppression. So Sikhs have always been about, but let me get my take on it.
That's fine.
So that comes in terms of actually the Sikhs not just being a passive community. Now this is
that's what I was about to say. That's what I was about to say.
This is
let me clarify. Being martial and
So this Sikhs were never passive. Whereas Guru Nanak wanted to get away from the cave dweller. The person who does the bhakti doesn't have to do it in a cave, has to be in the real world. So therefore, it was always about explaining this concept of Sant Sabai. We can be saint soldiers. We do believe in Miri and Biri. So that was like the starting point for this book. That's why the introduction talked quite a lot about that. And therefore, I wanted to actually explain a lot more about the missile period, and that's why I wanted to bring in Jassa Singh Ahluwalia. I wanted to bring in Jarat Singh Sukhachakya. Whilst already covered Baghel Singh partly in the British and Sikhs, this time I wanted to actually bring out other individuals from Aqam. But to make it even more novel, so we always have a novelty, and the novelty here was that we wanted to correct a few wrongs as well. And what I mean by that is we have a very masculine tradition, as you already know, in our Aqam. So therefore I wanted to pay homage to individuals like Sadaqur, on which Maharaja Ranjit Singh was able to latch onto to create his Sikh empire. I wanted to talk about Saib Kaur, the Patiala princess, who fought with a Britisher called George Thomas, for instance, who actually was able to fight against the Marathas. So I wanted to bring in new individuals who'd obviously not been given that kind of light, if we can say.
Well, Sadaqor has been covered by, who's the singer in Scotland? He's done a really good book on it. College Publisher.
It was a novel. That was a novel. I wanted to actually, because the literature I'd actually gone back to was, things like the Dwariks, for instance. I looked at various kind of citations which actually explain her role, both their roles actually, in Sikh history, which hadn't been covered before. So again, I wanted to cover them not just from their most important things they've done, but also their life histories as well. So that was important. But then, because we're talking about the martial tradition, the focus was also on how Maharaja Ranjit Singh changed, if we can say. So the martial tradition changes during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, because the Sikh Empire is now employing European mercenaries, for instance. So I've got a chapter on people like General Allard Ventura, Abu Tabale, General Court, and their history as well, and what they brought to the game, and how they changed the dynamics of the Punjab. But we sometimes are our own kind of worst enemies when it comes to like portraying our individuals. And one individual which we've never focused on is Lena Singh Majithia, a astronomer, a kind of linguist, a technology inventor, who created such great things for the Panth in the Punjab that his name is very, very talked about. So I thought, hold on, we've got British innovations, European innovations in the Sikh Empire, we need to focus on our Sikh aspects. More importantly, on what did Lena Singh Majitya do? He created gun foundries.
Yeah.
He improved on, when I talked about earlier, the Sikh cannons, for instance.
Yeah.
He improved on the British patterns, for instance. And he also wrote and was he dealt a lot with astronomy as well.
Yeah.
So these are the things that most people don't talk about. So he was doing that in the Sikh Empire, and as a result of that, he was an inventor as well. So I wanted to focus on him. He did a lot of work around the Harmandir Sahib as well, getting marble brought in for the kind of, around the Parkama and things like that. So his legacy was really important.
Yeah.
And of course...
Well, he had a sundial, didn't he? He
Yeah,
created
the sundial, which still exists.
Because I saw that when I was there. I took pictures of it when I was there.
We call it a doop gurry.
Yeah.
Doop gurry, or we call it that. And most people don't know, and most people ignore it.
Most people don't see it, right? They don't realise when you're going on your way to the Darbar side, on the main walkway,
left side,
it's on the left-hand side, about halfway up.
That's it.
And you just see it next to one of the poles. I remember I knew about it beforehand, so I was taking pictures when I was there.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was these kind of things which I wanted to actually kind of, whilst it's about Sikh soldiery, this book, but it's also about inventions as well. So that's why I had to focus on them. On top of that, the greats, Hari Singh Nalwa, Akali Phula Singh. When we talk about these names, we talk about them as almost like mythical figures sometimes, almost like they cannot be reached.
Yeah.
So I wanted to break down their histories as well.
Yeah.
So looked at in terms of the conquest that Hari Singh Nalwa had actually undertaken, and all the forts he'd created to cut off the Afghans for the first time.
Yeah.
These kind of concepts are really, really important to actually understanding how the Sikh Empire became as great as it did.
Yeah.
Akali Phula Singh. Well, we talk about his role as not just a Khalsa in the sense that he's a military genius, but also his spiritual genius, because when we go to the Akal Takht, he's a Jathadar of the Akal Takht as well. So the Nahangs all the Sikhs all pay homage to him. But I took a different story to actually show the actual nature of the Khalsa by when the British are hounding him.
Okay.
When he wipes out Captain White's camp,
battalion,
who's already there mapping Sikh territories out. Remember, this is in the area of Nabha, which is British territory at that time.
It was,
because of the
treaty signed.
Yeah, the treaty had already been signed, so he'd been attacking the British in their alleged territory, so to speak. So the story behind that was essentially to bring out the fact that no one in the Punjab could arrest him.
Yeah.
Letters going out to Maharaja Ranjit Singh saying, can you arrest him? He doesn't do anything because he knows the whole wrath of Punjab would happen. Nabha's been told to capture him. They're saying, well, we can't do anything. Other people have been told. And basically, this was a big challenge to the British.
Yeah.
There is no Banda on earth who can arrest Akali Phula Singh.
Yeah.
So it was these kind of stories which I wanted to bring about, not just from the traditional idea of these battles, but also in terms of what power they wielded, not just in the Punjab, but when you read the British letters, how are they describing Akali Phula Singh?
Yeah.
Can you see where I'm coming from?
So, of course.
So we get to the end of this book in terms of actually, again, talking about Sikh recruitment in the Indian Army, but this time I'm going to talk about campaigns now. I'm talking about campaigns which most people had never heard of. How the Sikhs had gone to a place like Africa, for instance, how they'd gone to Malta, how they'd fought in against the western frontier, and also Burma and various other places. So very small descriptions has also been placed about all the battles in the colonial period as well. So I think it's a rounded kitab which covers a lot of material again, but expands on various themes from the British and the Sikhs as well.
No, that's awesome, sir. The question that's going to be asked, and we always ask, is going to be, what's next?
You've heard me mention the word missiles.
Yeah.
So I've been working on trying to create a comprehensive account on the missiles. But the information is vast. What do? Do we concentrate all the 11 missiles plus one? Or do we concentrate on a specific missile? My research is centered quite a lot on the Gurinder Singh missile.
Yeah.
Nothing related to Ratan Singh Pungu, even though he's done a work on the missile itself. My trajectory has always been on looking at the conquest of the Sikhs towards Delhi, around Delhi, all the way to Anupshahr. I talk about them in previous works I've done, rather than the conquest in Lahore, going towards Peshawar, because that's the Bungi missile, that's the Kajakia missile. They're all important. So I am working on a book. I've started writing as well. How much I cover of all the 11 missiles, I will do, 11 plus 1. The reason I call it 11 plus 1 is we have the main missiles and then we have the plus 1, which is the Fulkian missile, even though they were never called Fulkian missile, by the way.
No, but it was given as a collective.
Yeah, it's given as a collective. So I'm working on that. It may be a year or two before that would come out. I'm working with various publishers, of which publisher I'm going to go with on this one. So that's in the making. Something which most people may not be aware of is we are going to be having a Sikh soldier statue installed in Leicester.
Yeah, I've already seen Taryn's working on that.
Yes, so I've been working on that for several years. I was commissioned to work with artists like Taran, but also to actually work on the project management of it. Okay. So that's due for installation in around October 22. So that's taking place. So we're working busy on that as well. And then just from the Sikh Museum Initiative perspective, we are looking at doing more 3D models as well.
Yeah.
And then another icing on the cake is I am actually working on my first documentary as well.
Okay.
So the theme is probably going to be based around Sikh relics and artefacts.
Yeah.
So we're going to start filming that later on this year.
Yeah.
So that's in conjunction with Sikh Lens, based in America.
Yeah.
So we started chalking out a trajectory on that as well. So even after 25 years plus of working, there's still further projects because the job is never done, essentially. I mean, I'm trying to slow things down a little bit, but at the same time, you can't slow down.
How much are you going to be able to cover? Is it like a series of documentaries or just one?
No, this specific one is just going to be...
That's going to be difficult choosing just a couple of items.
Now, you mentioned about earlier on about specific...
Well, that's it, but you're going to have to, aren't you? You're going to have to limit it down.
That's it. So I'll take a cue from yourself.
I know what I'd cover straight away. I know.
So.
I can see 10 items in my head now that I'd cover.
Yeah.
Not just on Sikh history, but, when you're just looking... I could walk into the V&A and you could do 20 to 30 documentaries in just the V&A today.
No, absolutely. And this is the thing. It's such a varied field, but, you have to kind of pigeonhole it in terms of one specific area, and so therefore it'll be on Sikh relics and artefacts, really. So,
No, that's awesome, sir. Right, Singh, I think we've covered quite a bit with regards to the today's podcast. I just want, prior to us finishing off, can you put forward your social media accounts and details? Because there's going to be people out here, like I said, for me, the big process is you've gone through how to publish books. You've gone through all these different things. You've been on the news and, all sorts of antiques roadshows and whatnot. But you've been on those things, and you've not even mentioned them. But what I'm saying is there's a big portion of work that you have done, which there's going to be youngsters out there going, I want to do this. How do I get there? And the best way is don't contact me, contact you. Why put me in a punga? Put you in a punga, that's better.
No, you know what? Singh, I think one thing which we didn't have was a hand up when we were starting. And you could probably appreciate that yourself, where you went up to people, you didn't get that help, and no one knew, you didn't know where to start, so you had to do it yourself. So now we're in that position where anyone who asks those questions, we're more than welcome to help them.
Exactly.
We want more Gurinder Singh Manns, we want more Kamalpreet Singh Badeshis out there. We want so many researchers out there. We're just at its infancy of still doing this gum. Even after all these years of working, we're still at its infancy. So we need more researchers out there. So we welcome questions. And so my main websites are www.sikhscholar.co.uk. That's my personal website, which talks about my work I've done for many years. We have the Sikh Museum website, which is www.sikhmuseum.org.uk, But coming off that, we have the main website for the 3D relics, which is www.anglo-sikhmuseum.com. And we can provide links on the podcast on how to get in touch.
Okay, what about your own social media accounts?
So my social media accounts...
Because you're on Facebook,
yeah.
you're on Instagram,
so Facebook
you're on
is
things, right?
Facebook is Gurinder Singh Mann.
Yep.
Twitter is I think it's Gurinder Singh Mann as well. On Instagram it's Sikh Scholar.
Sikh Scholar, yeah.
Sikh Scholar. So we've got those. So they're the three main ones which are predominantly used.
And that's it, because youngsters today, they don't fucking look up websites, do they?
No.
You know, unless they're pigeonholed and there's a link on there. So the likelihood, if you're going to get questions, is going to be on one of those. So
absolutely, and I get.
If you want to start blocking people out now, you can do it today. But I just thought I'd warn you now.
Very rarely have I blocked anyone. Very rarely. I mean, even if there's been, people don't like the work I do, or
you still. I don't block anyone.
Blocking or unblocking, it's more a case of I'll ignore them. But
that's fine, isn't it?
That kind of stuff. I don't have to answer your questions.
Exactly.
But I think also the key point, which we've not addressed as part of this documentary, is asking the question the right way.
Yeah.
Ask the question the right way and you'll get the answer you want. But I think sometimes we don't even know how to ask the right questions sometimes. So, But no, really appreciative of yourself, Baisab as well, doing the filming as well, in terms of coming here today. Like you said, you've only scratched the surface of the work.
That's the point,
I've done, but there may be a mocha for something.
Exactly,
else
but
future,
the whole point is, you've talked about your work. You've done it with ramblings. You've done it online. You've done it at museums. If people want to know your work, they can come.
ITV,
yeah, but that's what I mean. You've done that. You've done all that bullshit. Nobody knows how much work you've done in the background. So that sort of thing. If people are intrigued in your work, they'll come to it. Like we come to you, whenever you have something at a museum or whatever.
Absolutely.
We'll come to it because we're intrigued and we want to keep learning.
And
that's the whole point of this. We want other people to get eyes on this and go, well, hang on. We had Singh come from Northampton, Azadis, and he came down that day. And
absolutely.
Obviously, Kartar Singh was there, Bajja was there. But, Punjabi, people are there who want to learn.
And this great thing, I've got to give a shout out to Kartar Singh, Rajman, Taran from Taran 3D, individuals I've worked with for the last couple of years, and great support. It's a great community thing as well. It's like, it's getting people out there. During lockdown was a bit of a pain. But we're back out on the road as well, so we're going to be doing a lot of digital showcases again throughout the year. So we get out the digital touch screens. If you get the virtual reality headsets out as well, so people haven't seen that. So
I've got pictures of that, so that will go whenever we come down. So I've got loads of that sort of stuff.
So it's a community events as well. So it's not just for our farm, like I said, it's all for regular individuals just to kind of learn more about Sikh Ityas as well. So that's the beauty of our initiative essentially.
No, it's wicked. Have you got any questions for us about the podcast?
No, Singh, I think you're doing a great job in terms of actually what you've created. You've created a platform for researchers, individuals are doing great gum, and just keep up the great work and we'll take it from there. But look forward to the end of the podcast and sharing it out with individuals. And again, Kamalpreet, want to say thank you as well because you do a lot of work in the community. You've written quite a lot of books as well. And you're doing your thing as well, and we need more people like yourself and myself out there just getting the outputs. And I think that's the beauty of it.
And that's the whole point of this: it's to encourage. The issue we have, and we've said this on this podcast numerous times, we're in our 40s and 50s. We're all coming up to that age.
That's it.
Where are the people in their 20s today?
Yeah.
Because I can't see them.
They don't exist.
And that's the issue. Where are the people in their 20s today? And that's worrying.
It is worrying.
That's worrying because you look at it, you go, well, we should be going and handing over stuff to other people now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they should be taking the lead, but I can't see them. I can't see them at all.
There's very few in between of those people. Yeah.
At the moment, I don't see them, and the whole point is this, is to ignite that sort of spark in those individuals and go, actually, I am at that age. These are all working as well. It's not like we do this. We do everything in our spare time. We've all got jobs. We all work 12-hour days, 16-hour days sometimes. We're still doing this. It's to try to get the next generation to go, I want to do that.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I just want to say thank you very much for having us on. And we appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
And I apologise. We were supposed to come earlier. Idiot over there has chopped his finger off.
Well, we all have issues sometimes now, and we won't comment about this.
That's right. But no, on behalf of the podcast, Flawed, fantastic. I want to say thank you for being fantastic today, And I've learned a lot from, like I said, all the years I've learned loads from you, and I'll continue to learn. But thank you. Waheguru Ji Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Fateh. Cheers.